Hey kiddos, so today we are going to talk about territorial and economic expansion between the years of 1830 to 1860. So in this lecture, it does kind of overlap with what we've been talking about previously with kind of this growing sectionalism, kind of like in a more like isolated way, to where in this lecture, we're really going to start talking about how these issues are going to lead towards the Civil War. So this is a part of period 5, which does include the Civil War. In this lecture, we're going to talk all the way up until 1860. So a lot of these things are historical context for the war itself. You can even use some of the examples that we talked about today for this growing division between the North and the South, in particular, as we lead up to the secession of South Carolina in 1860. So first, let's talk about Manifest Destiny. You have probably seen this image of Columbia. So this is called American Progress. It was actually painted in the 1870s to kind of reflect back on this time period in the 1830s, 1840s in particular, where Americans really responded to John O'Sullivan's view of what Manifest Destiny was. And it was this belief that, and it was extremely popular for the time, it was this belief that it was America's God-given right, their divine mission to extend its power west, and so that civilization could grow across the continent. And so providing context for that, right? So we're talking about the 1830s and 1840s. The Second Great Awakening is going to play a role in that one, especially like that God-given right that, Americans feel as though they are destined to move west and to spread their civilization. That's within context of the Indian Removal Act. Now that's, east of the Mississippi River, where this lecture is mostly looking at territories kind of like toward more westward than the Mississippi River, but still that provides context for how Americans saw how land belonged to them. And so we've removed Native Americans, and now they're going to set their eyes on parts of Mexico and Oregon. And again, that it's their kind of right. And even that sense of like paternalism, like we can do better with this land than you can. So it's driven by that sense of nationalism that we've been talking about since after the War of 1812, this belief that they are kind of like superior. You have, again, we've talked about that large population increase, not only because of a high birth rate, but also because of immigration. Because of the market revolution, you have that rapid economic development and technological advances that are going to help get people westward. And then also it's going to kind of like drive the economy as well to kind of connect the East Coast and the West Coast economically. In previous lectures, we talked a little bit about connecting kind of like the old Northeast cities to the old Northwest, kind of what we call the Midwest today, like Midwestern farmers. So now we're going to extend that even further all the way to California and kind of connect these two economies, the two coasts. And again, the reform ideals of that, that God-given right to move and to conquer this land, and whatever you need to do politically in order to kind of achieve that. Now, with all of that being said, not everyone was in favor of westward expansion and Manifest Destiny. There were a lot of Northerners, even though like economically, it benefited some Northerners. And again, that's the complexity of this time period where, especially when we talk about the institution of slavery, some Northerners, however, particularly from the Whig Party, so if we start talking about our political parties, which is very important in understanding this time period, are going to be worried about Southerners wanting to expand strictly to expand the institution of slavery and spread the institution of slavery into Western states. A lot of people always say that that slavery was a cause of the Civil War, and there's no doubt about it. It was the main cause of the Civil War, but it had more to do with this fear of Southerners that Northerners wanted to limit the expansion and then eventually gain enough states, free states, to have enough power in Congress where they were scared that they might try to abolish the institution altogether in the South. But it's also very important understanding that with a lot of these motives, there was no real threat at this point in time in history to where they wanted to abolish slavery where it already existed. It was more about the expansion of slavery in the West. That was what was controversial. That's what they're going to argue about starting in the 1820s. You have 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. We've now skipped a few decades because of that compromise. It was like the little Band-Aid over the bigger issue. Well, now we're going to have a lot of problems pop up as more states are going to be admitted to the Union, and Southerners are really setting their eyes on how can we expand slavery into other territories. And so it's almost like an imperialist view. That's how Southerners use Manifest Destiny, where they were looking at Mexico. They were looking in the Caribbean. They wanted to gain as many slave states as possible in order to have more power on a federal level. And that really worried a lot of Northerners as well. So as we talk about in this lecture and in the next lecture, the Union in Peril, really kind of pay attention to it. It's kind of like a tit for tat type thing, where it's this competition for power that is going to lead to eventually the Civil War. So first, let's start with Texas. Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1823. Now, Texas, what we know of Texas today, was a part of Mexico. So if you look at the map, you'll see kind of like where the Louisiana territory ended, and then you can see that that Spain had all that territory. Well, now Mexico, and it was a large nation. So the Mexican government in 1824 was encouraging Americans, especially Southerners, and this kind of goes with that same time period that we talked about before, where they were expanding their cotton kingdom into Mississippi and Alabama. Well, Mexico started to encourage Americans to come a little bit further out into the northern, kind of like the northeastern part of Texas, which a lot of people think of Texas as desert. Texas is a huge state. A lot of it is desert, especially when you kind of go more southwest. But in the northeastern part or northern part of Texas, there's a lot of fertile land, especially with rivers and things like that, that was conducive to growing cotton. And so they're encouraging Americans to come in, and they came in first with the Austin family. So Stephen Austin established the first successful American settlement, about 300 families in Mexico, in the northern part of Texas. They are Southern farmers that are looking to expand their cotton kingdom and expand their empires, right, if you will, and make more money, seeking economic opportunities. And they brought their slaves with them, okay? In 1829, however, so 5 years later, Mexico decides to pass a law that bans the institution of slavery and also wanted immigrants to convert to Roman Catholicism, okay? Now, a lot of these American immigrants who were living in Northern, and again, they're kind of separated, they're kind of far away from Mexico City. In most cases, they do not follow those rules. They continue to bring in slaves. They continue to breed their slaves. They are, they don't convert to Roman Catholicism. So there's some tension, right? Because how are you going to enforce those laws? And they didn't do a very good job of enforcing it. Think of it as salutary neglect, if you will, okay? But by 1836, Americans, both enslaved and white, are going to outnumber the Mexicans in that region, in Texas, 3-1. So it's starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger. In addition to that, there is a turnover in power. So General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is going to come to power. He is going to overthrow not overthrow, but he's going to basically reinstate a dictatorship or instate a dictatorship within Texas. And he is now going to use the military to enforce those laws in Texas. He can't stand the fact that these white Americans have come in and are blatantly disregarding their rules. And so Sam Houston and the Texans by this point say, like, we're not going to follow these rules and we're going to revolt against that power. Okay. So they declare Texan independence. Sam Houston is the leader in this revolt. And then there are a series of battles. Now, the Mexican army was much larger than that of the Texan, militia or army, if you will. One of the most famous battles is going to be the Battle of the Alamo in San Antonio, where the Mexican army defeats the Texan rebels. And it was kind of this like battle cry, if you will. The reason that we kind of teach it and why it's famous in Texan history is like everyone died at the Alamo, including Daniel Boone, a little bit of local history. But what they did, and there's a lot of like reasons why they were seen as martyrs, but they kind of sacrificed themselves in order to inspire Texas or the Texans as a whole to really rise up and try to fight the Mexicans and try and earn their independence. And that's what ended up happening. If Mexico had defeated them at the Alamo and then defeated them in general and never captured Santa Anna, you wouldn't know anything about the Battle of the Alamo and remember the Alamo. That wouldn't have been a thing. But because they ended up defeating the Mexicans and earning their independence, as they believe they did, it became this famous, martyrdom of the people that died at the Alamo. So spoiler alert, sorry, I told you that they ended up getting their independence. In basically a little bit of luck, but also under the leadership of Houston, he was able to defeat the Mexican army and actually took Santa Anna as prisoner towards the end of the war. They basically forced him, by threatening to kill him, they forced him to sign the Treaty of Velasco. Now, this is where it can get a little bit confusing. The Treaty of Velasco granted, according to Santa Anna, so they had Santa Anna sign it, saying that Texas was independent and that the land, like its boundaries, went all the way to the Rio Grande. Okay, so the Rio Grande River today is the border between the United States and Mexico. And that is what the Treaty of Velasco said based on what Santa Anna signed. So the Americans, the Texans believed that that was the treaty that gave them their independence. However, the Mexican government refused to ratify that treaty. They said, no, Santa Anna doesn't sign treaties like we sign treaties. And so they considered Texas to still be a part of Mexico. Meanwhile, Texas is going about business as usual. They've got a constitution. They consider themselves independent. Houston even requests annexation by the United States, files the paperwork, and both President Andrew Jackson and President Van Buren are like, no, we don't want to mess with that, okay? Because there was such opposition, right? Imagine if the United States annexed a territory that another nation believed was their own land, right? They didn't want war. They didn't want to have to worry about it. Northerners were also upset because it's very obvious that Texas would then be admitted as a series of slave states. Okay, so eventually, when we do annex Texas, and it actually is still possible today, is that Texas can, by the Constitution, actually be broken up into 5 different states because of its large landmass. Okay, now the people of Texas, that's within their right to do, but they've never chosen to do that. They liked the idea of Texas, right? Like the Lone Star State, this huge state. They've kind of kept it that way on purpose, but they have the ability, because the Constitution or the Congress, when they approved the annexation of Texas, they actually approved for it can be up to 5 states. So we'll talk about that a little bit in class and about how that could be kind of interesting with like the Electoral College and like all that type of in the United States Senate. But anyways, So John Tyler, so if you guys remember, so Jackson and Van Buren lost re-election to Harrison. Harrison dies within like 30 days. He gets sick and dies. And John Tyler, his accidency is that Southerner. He was kind of thrown on the ticket to be, so Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He was thrown on that ticket in order to kind of attract Southerners. Not really a Whig. He was a Southerner. He was an expansionist. He wanted to annex Texas, but the Senate rejected it in 1844. Okay, we'll come back to Texas in a second as it's going to lead to the war with Mexico. Some other issues that are going on, and this is just going to be really quick, is Britain. Britain, though, at this point in time was actually still seen as our largest rivalry, right? And there were never some boundaries determined between Britain, which is Canada, and the United States and that northern tip of Maine. Okay, so you have the Battle of the Maps that's going to result in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. Some people call it the Lumberjack War, which I always think is really interesting, where some lumberjacks are upset about territory, and this fight happens between the Canadians and the Americans. In the end, they negotiate the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which is that top tip of Maine, and then also a part of Minnesota. Looking at Oregon, okay, the Oregon Territory stretched all the way up to Alaska. And basically you have 4 different countries that have kind of been like dabbling in kind of like claiming the land over the last 100 years or so. The United States is going to base its claim on the fact that American had discovered the Columbia River. The biggest one, I think, was the fact that way back when in 1805, Lewis and Clark, when they as a part of their expedition and exploring the Louisiana Territory, they went all the way to the Pacific as they were looking for that Northwest Passage. When they got there, they built a fort. They stayed the winter. We kind of talked about that, but they planted an American flag there. And that means something in that age of exploration, like even before that. Like if you establish a settlement, you lay some claim. In addition to that, a little bit later, we will talk about the westward trails, and we'll talk about the Oregon Trail. Well, in the 1840s, there were thousands of Americans that had gone out to the Willamette Valley in Oregon and had created Christian missions, again, Second Great Awakening, and had converted Native Americans. They had converted miners. And so they had established settlements there. And so that also is going to help lay claim. We will eventually solve that when we talk about the Oregon Treaty, which is going to be happening kind of simultaneously as the Mexican-American War. So moving into 1844, John Tyler was not well liked by his party, the Whigs. And so they are going to nominate Henry Clay in 1844. The Democrats didn't want Tyler either because he had won previously on a Whig ticket. And so they are now looking for a Democratic candidate. Now, as early as 1844, the Democratic Party is going to be kind of divided between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats over the institution of slavery expanding into the West. So Van Buren's back. And he is running for president, or running for the nomination for the Democratic Party. However, John C. Calhoun, South Carolinian, is running kind of on the Southern Democratic view of the expansion of slavery. Like he is pro-expansion. And I want you to think of that in general. Southerners were pro-expansion. They wanted as much territory as possible so that they could, especially in the Southern tract, in order to spread the institution of slavery and get more slave states, okay? So the Democratic Party is kind of torn. And they go to the convention, it's split, and they decide to kind of vote again. And what they basically come to is, we don't need a Northern Democrat like Van Buren. We don't need a kind of like radical John C. Calhoun, like pro-expansion of slavery. Like we need something kind of like down the middle that's would be willing to take on Oregon and Mexico, right? And get Texas. And so they nominated a dark horse candidate, kind of came out of nowhere, in James K. Polk. He was from Tennessee. He was a protege of Andrew Jackson. Like they had kind of like a mentorship. He believed in expansion, but just like in expansion, like on a nationalist level. instead of just like pro-slavery and like we want all these slave states. And so that was enough to where he was able to get the nomination. He campaigned on this 54-40-year fight. So it was really focused on Oregon, where he wanted to basically the 54th parallel all the way up to Alaska, that he was going to say that part of his administration, they were going to negotiate that treaty where they were going to obtain the Oregon Territory. And if Britain didn't like it, like we were going to fight. And like that was kind of the thing that kind of got him to win the presidential election. Poor Henry Clay is lost again, mostly because he flip-flopped on the issue of the annexation of Texas. And he lost a lot of New York abolitionists that joined the Liberty Party. And so those electoral votes, those 36 electoral votes, really helped Polk win in 1844. Really know Polk as the expansionist president because of the amount of territory that he added within his single term, his single administration. So Tyler, when Polk was elected, Tyler took that as an approval of the American people that people wanted Texas. Okay, so he persuaded Congress then to, instead of going the correct way about it with like the Senate signing a treaty to annex it, he decided to push forward a joint resolution to annex Texas, which was a little bit different than how it normally had been done. So that, because by that, instead of needing 2/3 of the Senate to ratify, they just needed majority in both the House and the Senate, and the within both of those, like the Democrats that were kind of pro-expansion had control over that, and left Polk to kind of deal with the side effects. Because again, remember, if you annex Texas, it could lead to war with Mexico. Okay, so Polk enters, and one of the first things that he does do is he pursues this Oregon Treaty. But instead of like threatening or possibly going to war and having 2 wars, because they're going to go to war with Mexico as well, and that's what kind of distracted most Americans, is that the war with Mexico is kind of like a bigger issue. They didn't want to also go to war with Britain. And basically what they did is, like, instead of going all the way to the 54th parallel, they're like, hey, let's call halvesies. And so instead they did the 49th parallel. Now that was established in 1818 with the Louisiana, part of the Louisiana Territory Treaty, and to kind of define that border. And basically what the Americans said is like, listen, it's real cold above the 49th parallel. Like, we're not going to make a bunch of money that way with like fur trading. And Britons feel like the same, like the fur trade is kind of on the decline. Really our issue was agriculture. We're not going to have like, cornfields and wheat fields above the 49th parallel. And so they just said, hey, let's just call it halvesies. And that is our current border today between Canada and the United States. Okay. A lot of Southerners kind of called it, Northerners were a little upset about this because they saw this, well, even if we're not going to grow anything there, it's still like, it's free states that can be added to the Union, which means more representation, based on, even if there's not heavily populated, it's still, 3 electoral votes or 2 members, 2 senators and 1 member of the House. And so that they were really wanting to get more Northern representation because they see what's going on in Mexico as Southerners are about to add a bunch of slave states to the Union. Okay, so Polk takes office. He's dealing with the thing and with Oregon and Britain. Okay, the same time though, because he ran on this expansionist platform, and because he's trying to kind of appease both the Northerners and the Southerners. Again, remember though, he's a Democrat. He is all about getting Texas, but also he wants to purchase basically California, Arizona, Nevada, right? So we're going to end up calling it the Mexican Cession. So he really wants California. He wants to extend the Union from coast to coast, right? So he wants that part of the country. And so Polk sends John Slidell to Mexico City to negotiate the purchase of this territory, and to also figure out this disputed territory, as you can see for the image above. Again, so Mexico has recognized like Texas as independent, but to the Nueces River, not to the Rio Grande. And so there you can kind of see that disputed territory. So Mexico refuses both. We're not going to sell you New Mexico and California. The border is the Nueces River. Like you can have that little chunk, but like everything else is Mexico. And in fact, like I've read that like he wouldn't even let Slidell like in the building to negotiate. It was like he had to like they had the written correspondence, even though Slidell was in Mexico City, which is kind of like a slap in the face. So as they're waiting to hear back from Mexico City, from the Mexican government, Polk, meanwhile, orders General Zachary Taylor to move his army south of the Nueces River all the way down to the banks of the Rio Grande. Okay, so on this image, they are technically in this disputed area. Okay, when the Mexican army sees this on April 26, 1846, they cross the Rio Grande. They captured American Army patrol and they killed 11 of them. Okay. Now, before any of that happened, President Polk had already written a speech to Congress asking for a declaration of war. Okay. So Polk knew what he was doing, right? If they weren't going to give him what he wanted diplomatically, he was ready to go with basically like drawing them into war. And that's exactly what he did, right? So now he can speak. Now, basically what they did is they added into the speech asking for this declaration of war. They added into it like American blood has been shed on American soil. Now, any person that actually looks at the facts would know, well, we think it's American soil, but Mexico thinks it's Mexican soil. So what are we going to do? And this was something that the Whigs had said years ago, where they're like, no, we don't need to annex Texas because it's going to lead to an issue just like this. One of the Whigs that was pretty outspoken about it and actually questioned President Polk like by name and was very skeptical of this American blood spilled on American soil was a Whig by the name of Abraham Lincoln. He was brand new to the House of Representatives from the state of Illinois. And remember that the House of Representatives is a 2-year term. So these are congressmen and congresswomen. And when he came out against that, and some other Whigs did too, but overwhelmingly, the Congress did declare war on Mexico. And Abraham Lincoln actually lost re-election because he was kind of seen as unpatriotic, even though like to us now with retrospect, we're kind of like, well, that was real shady. Lincoln saw it. So most of the war is going to be fought in Mexican territory. You don't need to know certain battles or anything like that. American forces were pretty small, took over parts of New Mexico, Texas, or parts of that disputed area of Texas pretty easily as well. John C. Fremont in California actually like overthrew the Mexican government. They were declared themselves an independent republic, the Bear Republic. So if you've ever wondered why there's a bear on the California flag. And then they started to move south into like towards Mexico City pretty quickly. So two important generals, Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. We'll talk about Winfield Scott a little bit later. One of my favorite things that I talk about with them is Old Rough and Ready and Old Fuss and Feathers. That's what their nicknames were. And I'll show you pictures of them in class where, I mean, Taylor was just kind of like an old Southern boy. And like, he was always known for wearing a straw hat. And then Winfield Scott was always like, whenever there was a battle, like he would dress in his finest regalia. And so that's where kind of some nicknames for those two. So they go all the way south, all the way to capture Mexico City by September. So it's pretty quick, right? Within a couple months. And then they force the government to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So Mexico recognizes the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. Okay. Which is going to be the southern border of the United States, which is still that today. And then the United States paid the $15 million that Polk was willing to pay them for this Mexican cession. So present day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, part of Colorado. Whigs opposed the treaty because, again, they see this as an extension of slavery. The whole reason that they wanted to go to war was so that they could extend the institution of slavery. Southern Democrats were upset because they withdrew from Mexico City. Right? Southern Democrats wanted all of Mexico to be a part of the United States. And it probably couldn't have been that way. Like, you're probably wondering, like, well, we won, right? We invaded Mexico City. So why not, why didn't we get all of Mexico? Well, remember that these treaties have to be approved by the Senate, right? So it needed to be kind of like bipartisan, if you will, in order to get enough people on board. And I think that even some Democrats, so like Northern Democrats, were like, ooh, like this is shady. And so you had to get Northern Democrats on board to sign the treaty as well. Now, with that, something that was proposed in 1846, and this was what really this is a really good piece of evidence to show why Southerners were so adamant about gaining more territory. And it was the Wilmot Proviso. So within a month into the war, that first year of the war, Wilmot proposed a piece of legislation where it says, okay, if this war is really about American blood being spilled on American soil, and it's not about expanding slavery, then let's right now pass a law that will prohibit slavery from expanding into any territory that is won from this war. And he proposed this piece of legislation. Southerners were appalled by it. They were like, why are you trying to limit it? What are you trying to do? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And they saw it kind of as this threat. Now, the Wilmot Proviso was not passed because of that. However, this is a really good piece of evidence, like showing you this more examples of this tension between Northerners and Southerners over the expansion of slavery. And we're going to continue to kind of add more examples, kind of that tit for tat. Like, here's the Wilmot Proviso. Oh yeah, well, here is, Dred Scott or whatever it is. So that's kind of important in understanding. So when things didn't really go the way that Southerners wanted with the outcome of the Mexican War and the Mexican cession, so remember, they wanted all of Mexico, they decided to start looking elsewhere, and they started looking into other parts of Latin America because, again, they're looking for soil that would be conducive for agriculture and kind of that plantation style economy that has worked well for them during this cotton boom in the Deep South. So Polk offered to purchase Cuba from Spain for $100 million. Spain refused. That's like their last, this dwindling empire. If you think at one point Spain had all of South America and up through Central America and the Caribbean. And so Cuba is kind of like their last stronghold, pretty profitable, especially sugarcane plantations. We'll be talking about Cuba more during American imperialist movement as well. All the way fast forward to period 7. Okay. So some Southerners go into Cuba because they did allow American planters to kind of come in and help stimulate their economy. Some Southerners went into Cuba and attempted to take the island by force. They were defeated by the Spanish and executed. An important one, I think, is the Ostend Manifesto. So fast forward, Franklin Pierce is now president. Southerners are still Southern Democrat or a Democrat. Southerners are still pressuring him to go after Cuba, to add Cuba as a slave state. So Pierce sends American diplomats to Ostend, Belgium. And this is a secret deal because they didn't want Whigs and Northerners and Free Soilers, I'll talk more about them later, to catch wind of what was going on. They just kind of wanted to do this secret purchase or whatever, and be able to eventually hope that it could apply for statehood. Anyways, the deal was going to go down. Spain was willing to sell it. However, information was leaked to the American press. Northerners, Free Soilers, Westerners were outraged by the fact that the Pierce administration would try to do something like this. And so Pierce had to drop it, right? So Southerners kind of lost out on that option. So now this political cartoon is actually right there. The man being held at gunpoint is James Buchanan. Buchanan will later go on to become president. He's president when South Carolina secedes. So he was the American minister to England at this point in time. And so you see a bunch of guys kind of giving him a hard time and like different demands that they wanted, and just kind of talking about this is a good image about how practical Democrats carrying out the principle. So this was kind of mocking how Southerners would go about basically trying to like sneakily expand the institution of slavery. Another example of Southerners trying to conquer land in order to kind of expand the institution of slavery, you have the Walker expedition. So William Walker attempted to take the Baja Peninsula off the coast, like down where California is. It's part of Mexico in 1853. Was unsuccessful there, but in 1855 was actually able to take over Nicaragua. Other pro-slavery Southerners, eventually though, Hondurans and other Latin American countries in the area will take over Walker and his followers or supporters, and they'll execute him in 1860 as like the war is about to begin in the United States. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty is a treaty between the United States and Great Britain. So one of the things that people were already looking for is building a canal or creating a canal that would go through Central America. Neither side, both the Britain and the Americans both knew that they wanted to do it, but they also weren't economically or technologically ready to quite take on that issue. And then obviously the Civil War is going to kind of delay that a little bit. So basically what they did is they came to an agreement that they were going to do it, but they wanted to be able to, that they would not attempt to do it individually. So it's just saying like, hey, listen, we know you want to do this. We know that you want to do it. Let's agree that we're not going to do it yet. Eventually, you guys know that we'll help construct the Panama Canal. So we will sign a new treaty with Britain that will basically give us permission to do that eventually. But that's a whole other thing that we'll talk about during the American imperialism unit as well. And then another kind of like shady thing that went down with Southerners that actually they were able to follow through with it is the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. So Gadsden was a Southerner. And again, in 1853, contextually, the Civil War they're really thinking any day now, right? Even though we're 7 years away from South Carolina seceding, Southerners were starting to worry that if they seceded, there was talk of a transcontinental railroad, which we'll eventually get to as well. And different plans are being laid out for a route, like which is the route that's going to connect these eastern cities to California and Oregon and places like that. So Southerners were worried that it was going to go through the north because that was the best line geographically. And so because of the Rocky Mountains and how far they stretched and where the border was with the Mexican cession. And if you go just south, a little bit further, I'm not even really sure how many miles, maybe 100, 200 miles, you could go around the mountains, but that's in Mexican territory. So Southerners had the idea to approach Mexico once again to purchase a tiny strip of land. And from the map that we'll do in class, you'll be able to see just how small it was. For $10 million. It's called the Gadsden Purchase. It's south of the Rocky Mountains, and it kind of dips down at the bottom part of Arizona and New Mexico. And the intent for that tiny strip of land was that so Southerners could propose a transcontinental railroad that it would have a southern route, right? So that it could connect, those eastern cities and southern cities, I guess, to California. And they were trying to kind of persuade that this was the way that they should go. And they also wanted to have access to California If there was a war, they want to be able to have control over those rail lines. But because the war will happen, and because the South didn't have the financial backing to do their own transcontinental railroad during the secession period of time, that railroad will never come to be. So we basically paid $10 million for southern Arizona and New Mexico. But they got it. Okay, by 1860, hundreds of thousands of migrants have started to move into the frontier. But what's interesting is they are skipping over, like today we kind of call them the flyover states. They're skipping over the Great Plains and they're going straight for the coast. So they're going to Oregon and Washington State and California. Most of them are going to start in Independence, Missouri. So this is like, if you've ever heard of the game Oregon Trail, this was a really popular game, like in the 90s and 2000s, like a computer game. It was extremely dangerous. So they are going to Oregon. They're going to the mining fields in like California and Utah and Colorado. Mormons are finding their way to Salt Lake City. Slow travel, overland travel is extremely slow, about 15 miles per day. It was dangerous. So not only mostly it was weather and disease. The Sierra Nevada mountains, you had to make sure that you left, because it was a long process. So you had to make sure you left at the right time so that you could get through before the first, and the snow would fall at that point, like as early, you guys have already seen that there's snow like in certain parts of the country, especially in high elevation. So you would have to get through like by the end of summer in order to avoid that. A lot of people died on the trails going through the mountains. Gold is going to be discovered in 1848 in California outside of San Francisco, as well as in Nevada and the Dakota areas. And these mining towns are going to pop up. They were called 49ers because in 1849, this mass migration of people going into these mining fields, searching for gold. It's going to increase a lot of diversity. So you have a lot of Irish immigrants. Chinese are now coming by ship, coming into San Francisco ports. The Mexican Americans and Mexicans and Latin Americans are also coming in to try and strike with riches. However, that's really not the case. In most cases, it's the speculators that come out and buy large tracts of land that are going to make the most money, and people are going to end up working for wages. It's only the people that happened to be there in 1848 that owned land that had these land before people kind of came in and cleaned it all out. You have boom towns and ghost towns. So a boom town is, where the gold has been found, and then as soon as all the gold and silver has been found, they move on to the next one, and it kind of turns into a ghost town. So while Manifest Destiny is happening, you also kind of have this early industrial revolution that's continuing. Factory production is getting more and more efficient. It's centering around textiles in the New England area, which is fueled by the cotton gin and slave labor in the South, with growing cotton. After 1840, industrialization is going to start spreading into other states. So again, we talked about with the market revolution that the farmers provided food for the people in the cities, and the people in cities that worked in factories provided mass-produced goods to be consumed by the farmers. Ready-made clothing, firearms, iron tools. Elias Howe, the production of clothing. So now you can buy ready-made clothing by 1840. So where before, probably 60 years before, your mother is, spinning her own wool and knitting your clothing. Then it transitions to like fabric that you can go buy fabric and your mom makes your clothes. Now you can actually buy ready-made clothing. Samuel Morse and the telegraph is going to be extremely important, especially when we talk about the Civil War. But now you have instant communication, which is a little bit like to us, like, well, of course you have instant communication at this point in time in our history. But to think that it used to take weeks or months to like send a letter to get word, now you can send a telegram that is, from New York to eventually like San Francisco in a matter of 3 minutes, right? So if urgent word, and so think about how news will spread, think about how that's going to help businesses, think about how that's going to affect the war. Very, very important invention at this point in time in history. And what they're going to do is when they do build the Transcontinental Railroad, they're going to telegraph wire is going to follow the rail lines. So rail lines are going to start popping up mostly in the Northeast and Midwest. So where in the 1830s and 1840s, steam power for like steamships, right, with canals, that's the first major advancement in transportation. Now we have the most important advancement in transportation, which is going to be the rail line. Now, railroads are extremely expensive, which is why even though they had steam locomotive like power or steam power in the 1830s and 40s, it's very expensive to lay the rail line, and you need a lot of money in order to be able to do that, or large amounts of capital. It also is very expensive because you have to have a large amount of labor to lay the rail lines. So railroad companies were given loans and grants from states, eventually the federal government. They're looking for investors, so people are buying stock in these companies. It was eventually done or expedited during the Civil War. In the northern states, they invested a lot more time and money in the rail lines than the South did, again, because most large southern plantations were already making enough money and had close proximity to major like rivers. And so that had kind of already been established. So they were a little bit slow to industrialize, which is going to have a detrimental effect on their being able to kind of like be successful in the Civil War. Farmers are going to be more closely linked. And again, it's really going to help the North during the Civil War because they can transport troops and supplies and goods a lot quicker than Southerners are going to be able to do it. In regards to foreign commerce, so we still have tariffs at this point in time. They're trying to sell their goods and agriculture to other countries. And they're going to see a growth in these exports. So one, within shipping companies encourage trade and travel because they have regular schedules. Whale oil is what most people are going to use to light their homes. So if you think of like kerosene, like lamps, whatever, that was kind of like a little bit later, like after the Civil War. But before that, you would have an oil lamp that was whale oil. So the whale oil industry, especially in New England, benefited greatly during this time period, and even like street lights and things like that were powered or lit by whale oil. Ships are going to become better, so they go from the clipper that is able to actually the quickest way to get to the gold fields in California was not going overland, but instead purchasing a ticket that left New York and actually going around South America up back towards California. That was one of the quicker ways. And then by the 1850s, you have steamships, which are even quicker, larger capacity to store goods, and just a lower cost as well. So all of that, again, with technology and promoting American trade, kind of keeping those tariffs. Tariffs are still there, but they're not raising tariffs to the point where other countries are retaliating with tariffs. We'll kind of get to that. But at this point, for sure, foreign trade has increased. Now, leading up to 1857 was a horrible economic panic. Most of it had to do with railroad speculation. So remember we talked about like land speculation and like a speculative bubble to where more money is being invested in a certain industry or commodity, whether it be land or railroads, than what it's actually worth. And eventually that bubble will pop, right? And then everyone will kind of lose their money. So I make a connection to like the Great Recession in 2008. That was a housing market bubble, right? Like people were selling their homes for more than what they were actually worth. And eventually people are going to stop paying that amount for those homes, right? It's really not worth $300,000. It's more worth like $150,000. But so as you wait for that bubble to pop, and then the people that bought it for $250,000 are now out because they can't sell it for anything more than $100,000. So that was very similar with like with the railroads, is people were investing in these railroad companies, but yet there was no return on how they were actually helping the economy yet. It was kind of a long-term thing. So prices dropped dramatically as a result of the panic, which again, you're going to have bank runs and things like that. And again, it's going to hurt Midwestern farmers the most, which if Midwestern farmers aren't purchasing the consumer goods that are made in Northeastern cities, then you're going to have high unemployment there. What's interesting about all of this is that cotton prices remained the same. So they were less affected. And unfortunately, Southerners used this as an example of how their economy was superior to that of what was going on in the North. And they argued, and they used this, again, a few years away, 3 years away from South Carolina seceding. They're going to use this to as a justification for secession. It's like, oh, we don't need the Northern economy to help us. There's no need to have a union. We're better separate, especially as if there's thoughts that they could, the institution of slavery being threatened. They believe that the risk of leaving the Union was worth the reward. And unfortunately, that just for them, that's not going to happen. But they did use this economic panic as justification because the cotton prices stayed the same. The reason the cotton prices stayed the same is because they were such in high demand at that point in time. But eventually, cotton prices are going to come down after the Civil War and have detrimental effect on Southern planters, in addition to the consequences of how the war affects the Southern economy as a whole. Okay, so in my next lecture, we will talk about more political aspects and political division that's going to lead the Southern states to talk of secession. And we'll end that lecture with South Carolina seceding from the Union in the fall of 1860 in response to Abraham Lincoln's election. I hope you learned something, and I will see you next time. Bye.